Next item on the agenda is a significant one for the future of the RCDSO. It concerns the Professional Liability Program Expert Review Task Force Report. The material for this item is on pages 81 to 161 of your package, and this is an item for decision. Included in your package was the final report from the task force, as well as a briefing note with further analysis of the options. Some of you will recall that the Expert Review Task Force was launched in December of 2022 on the recommendation of the Audit Committee, now the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. The task force was asked to review the college-operated professional liability program and to specifically identify benefits and risks related to the program with respect to the college and to the public. They were also asked to identify ways to mitigate risks where possible. For today's discussion, you are being asked to consider these benefits and risks to decide on the future of the professional liability program with respect to the college. In a few minutes, you will hear from the registrar. Dan will walk you through the process undertaken by the task force and their report. We will then hear from Finance, Audit and Risk Chair Mark Eckler, and then we will have our full discussion. I will be keeping speakers list throughout, so let us begin the discussion with some remarks from Harinder. Harinder?
Thank you, Hanno. Council, this is an issue of great importance to all of us. The report was an excellent and thoughtful piece of work. I want to applaud the authors, who include two former council members, Sandy Venditti and Joseph Richards. The task force brought great expertise to this process. They all possess regulatory and malpractice liability provider expertise. Each of the members also has experience in the intermingling of regulation and liability. I think the task force has done an excellent job in framing the benefits and risks. Staff have provided an in-depth analysis in the briefing note that you all have. As we hear from Dan and as we discuss next steps, I urge you to consider the report and the decision we ultimately make with respect to our public interest mandate. While many of us are members of the profession, we must not become advocates for the profession as we consider this issue. I know this is a significant strategic decision that we must make as a council, and it is important that we make our decision as our roles as governors of the RCDSO. That means this decision is about an analysis of benefits and risks and what the college is prepared to accept for our future. Now, Dan's presentation will give you further context. Dan, can I hand it back to you?
Thank you, Harinder. And if I could have the slide deck. While the slide deck is coming up, I want to introduce Margot Orchard, who is back there and can wave. Margot has been the project manager on this work since January and has really allowed us to stick handle a very complex set of issues, working with the task force, who were terrific, and also in pulling together a report that is thorough and obviously comes to you from the task force, but Margot had a great hand in making sure that that was all completed. What you have before you are two things. You have a report from the task force. Those are the words of the task force. They have signed off on that, and there's a letter you can see in the front of that. And you have a briefing note that is further analysis that we have done as senior staff that allows us to really drill down further into some of the options that we'll talk about today. And I want to take you through this in a fairly comprehensive way, because it does involve a lot of issues that you won't necessarily deal with in your day-to-day lives. And I know that when I started, I came to this college as a regulator, a career regulator, and certainly had not very much not any direct experience and not very much indirect experience with the malpractice side of the equation. So a lot of learning has taken place by a lot of people over the last 3 years in my time. And I will walk you through, and we'll have lots of time for discussion, and we want to make sure that your understanding is as high as it can be. Next slide. So the purpose then today is to really get into the background. Why did we do this? To look at the report itself and the options that have come out of that report. And also to look at some next steps. Obviously, that will be dependent on your direction and your discussion. Next slide. So why did we do this? There's a number of reasons, and we've highlighted a few here. First of all, there are very few health regulators in Canada who are directly operating this kind of program. There are some. There are none in Ontario in terms of health, and there are a couple that you will have seen within this report as well, such as the College of Dental Surgeons of Alberta recently started a comparable program within the last year and a half or 2 years, and the Quebec College that operates a program. And there are differences in all of these programs, so I don't want any of you to think that they're all the same and we can compare apples to apples. This program, RCDSOs, was established in the 1970s, 1973. And it was determined in that day that there needed to be more accessibility to this kind of protection for patients and for the profession, and that it needed to be inexpensive. So I don't know if some of you were around at that time, but those were the drivers at the time that are written down in various documents. And to my knowledge, as I've studied this over the last 3 years, there is no study that I've come up with where somebody has stepped back and said, how does this work within a regulator? What are the benefits and the risks? I haven't been able to find that kind of analysis or approach. And I want to be really clear that this is about the interaction of a malpractice arm with a regulator and the duties that both of those entail. This has nothing to do with how the PLP program in its current iteration is operating. It is effective, it is efficient, it is doing a fabulous job. The staff come to work every day and they put in the effort to make sure that they're achieving the goals and the outcomes that we would hope for a program like this. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with how these tensions are navigated between the public interest mandate and protecting dentists with a malpractice arm. And we've had some negative attention on that. I don't want to say that it's been frequent or every day, but you can see that there has been some media that's followed this and has really asked those same questions. How do you do this within the same organization and justify that you are protecting patients at the same time that it appears that you're protecting dentists? There's also changing expectations of us as institutions, as regulators. Patients are more vocal, as they should be. Social media allows messaging and positions and whether it's real or perceived information to travel very quickly. And so the expectations and the ability to communicate has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And finally, the RCDSO's own audit committee, at my urging, started to look at this about 1.5 years ago and came to a point where it said, we just really need some more expertise and some experience to really dive into this. And so next slide, please. That was when the audit committee came here last December and council approved the formation of the task force. And over the month or so after the December meeting, this group was put together. And so you have heard reference to the two individuals at the bottom of the list, Joseph Richards, who's a former public member and a former chair of PLP committee, and Sandy Venditti, who's a former council member and former president. So representing the dentist community and understanding clinical practice and also the college and the regulator. The top 4 individuals have stellar reputations and credentials, and they have their foot in the different sides of this. So they're part of the Law Society and Law Pro, or architects, or the Canadian Medical Protective Association. The CMPA is not a regulator. It's an independent mutual defense organization, but it, by the nature of its work, it defends doctors who are undergoing civil actions and also regulatory actions. So it does understand the regulatory world, and the individual came to us with a lot of experience in that world. On the left side, you see the purpose. It was really to review the current program and understand it, to make recommendations about what those risks are and what the mitigation solutions would be, and to develop an implementation plan. And I'll tell you now that the implementation plan you don't have, because we need a direction. And I'll talk a little bit about how this task force approached its work. Next slide. So I won't go over this in any detail, but they were able to organize their discussions, which occurred over 6 months. They held 6 half-day meetings with lots of homework in between, and they were looking at understanding the current landscape and the program, really diving into the risks and the benefits, and really trying to understand what they meant, both to the college, to the public, and the profession. They looked at other models, which are in the report. They identified some options for you. They looked at what are possible mitigation strategies for each of the options. And they started to think about implementation, but as I mentioned, they weren't able to go down that road too far. And they came up with a number of recommendations, which are essentially recommendations to say, if then, if you do this, then you might expect this. They weren't a recommendation to this council. And again, I'll mention that as we get towards the end of this presentation. Next slide. I would urge you to think of this as the task force contemplated it. This is about the benefits and the risks that's based on the public and patients and the college as an institution, mostly the public and patients. This is not about dentists. We can acknowledge, and I will acknowledge, and I will talk about a lot of the benefits that come to dentists by the way the program has been structured, but our framing, your framing of this needs to be with respect to the public and the patients and the risks that may be incurred as a result of this tension that I spoke to. And there's the words that are in quotes on the left that I say many, many times. That's one sentence from our act, which is quite clear. In carrying out its objects, the college has a duty to serve and protect the public interests. And so we can acknowledge that assuring dentists that all dentists have malpractice protection is of benefit to the public and patients. But we also have those risks that I'll mention that lead us to operate in a very unpredictable environment with issues that relate to our mandate and reputation and regulatory requirements. Next slide. So I'll comment here on the benefits, and some of these you've heard recently. You've had some orientation around PLP. Access to coverage is the first, and that relates to when you get licensed here and when you renew, you automatically have access to this program. And that means that we don't have to do any audits or compliance. The 25 other colleges in Ontario, they expect a certain minimum amount for their membership, and they will go out and do random checks in some cases, and they'll make sure that the members have their malpractice insurance up to the level that's expected. We don't have to do that. We are able to provide that with the license fee. The ease to the public is there because they know that there is going to be the backstop if they have an issue. And there's a payment, whether it's in a settlement or an award. So that's going to be something that sometimes will not have the same kind of adversarial approach that you might have with members of the profession who are involved in commercial insurance products. And that we have some influence, not all influence, but some influence over how the program runs in terms of possibly leaning more towards payouts in certain situations. But at the end of the day, the program is there to ensure that the dentist's rights are protected. And so there will be adversarial processes, and it will have dentists versus patients. And that is not then an environment that is patient-friendly necessarily. So there's influence to some degree, but obviously that program is there for a reason. I'm going to spend a bit of time on risks. And before I do that and go to the subsequent slides, when the task force looked at the analysis, risks are generally looked at with objective data and in oftentimes subjective or value-based data. They're looking at it from the inability to quantify, but based on experience or expertise that they bring to the table and a collective conversation about what they think this means. So you'll see some visuals. They won't have numbers because it's really challenging to quantify. Financial obviously is much easier. But when you talk about reputational and regulatory risk, it's not easy to come up with numbers. You could apply arbitrary numbers based on where you think something fits on a spectrum, but they brought their collective wisdom, experience, and expertise to this exercise. Next slide. So I'm going to start with reputational risk. And what I mean by that is essentially the trustworthiness of the college, or what is seen to be the trustworthiness of the college and our integrity, and how external institutions and individuals would look at us as an entity, given all of the different factors that they know about. And when you think, as I've said, about the regulatory mandate of the college, it is to protect the public, and the PLP mandate is different. So our task force looked at this in terms of the probability, and they based this on experience. So we know that the college, this college specifically, has had criticism that is related to how we operate that program within our mandate. We know that there's growing mistrust in regulators, and we've seen that with, I talk about governance reviews, and that comes from the place of regulators not seen to be doing their jobs, and it starts at the top. And so we have to factor this in, and I know when I've talked to different groups over the last 3 or 4 weeks, this is one that's harder to wrap your minds around because it's not quantifiable, but it has real implications. There are real costs associated with risks that might be realized. So there may be costs because you have to step up your communications game and be more strategic in your communications. You might have to explore crisis management situations, and that might involve experts in crisis management and experts in government relations. When the public and the profession lose confidence in an institution or a regulator, that has a real impact. Some of it may not be easy to measure, but the profession that doesn't trust its regulator or loses respect for its regulator is a real problem. It's a real challenge. You know, we're not here for the profession, but we rely on the profession to carry out the expectations that will be of benefit to patients. When patients lose trust or the public loses trust, that can have a real impact in terms of whether they decide to come to the college with their concern or their complaint. And if we don't have people coming to us with their concerns or their complaints, and that does happen, and you see that in looking at various social media messaging that can happen around individual circumstances, that's a problem for a regulator if we're not seen to be doing the job that we're actually here to do. And at a very extreme end, the ministry has the authority to appoint a supervisor over any regulator or health regulator in the province. We have seen that. In 2011, we saw that the ministry appointed a supervisor to the College of Ventura. So it dismissed the entire council and the registrar and CEO and appointed an individual supervisor. I'm not suggesting that that happens frequently, but when there is this sense that the college or the governors are not doing the job that they are supposed to, when there is an issue that raises red flags and gets perhaps blown out of proportion or has some meat to it, there is the authority of the Minister of Health to appoint that supervisor. So there are obviously real costs that are tied to reputation. And the impact on the college integrity is real. It can be perceived and it can be based on misinformation, but it is actually real in terms of the impact potentially. Next slide. And I will take questions at the end, and we'll have a break as well. Regulatory risk is more about, are we doing our job? And I've talked about the duty, and our duty includes being able to address where there may be incompetence at play, where there may be professional misconduct at play. And we know that from a PLP side, that information is kept confidential for a variety of reasons. But you are potentially faced with a situation where PLP is dealing with an incident and the individual may not be competent. And that information under the current environment cannot be shared, is not shared. So what does that say about the regulator in terms of that friction and having a department that's doing that? And again, it's not about how they're doing their work, it's about the placement within the organization. The question came up at the task force, should the college be automatically informed? There was a lot of debate about whether moving information out of PLP under some circumstances to the rest of the college would obviously be seen as a positive by some stakeholder groups, and it would be seen as a negative mostly by the profession. Is this a safe environment? I come to you with my concern. I need to have your protection. And now the information's going out of this confine. So again, it's a real issue that we have to think about in terms of the organization and the risks that may be involved. At the end of the day, the RCDSO owns PLP. So how will can the public separate out the fact that we've firewalled these programs, we've put in place separation, but does the public understand that? Will they believe it? And how far can you go with separation before they start to believe it? And we just don't know those answers, but they're very real issues. And I've mentioned about the profession potentially losing trust in PLP as a safe haven if there were certain measures put into place. The other aspect that the task force talked a lot about was we had lawyers and architects, or at least individuals that are representing those organizations at the table. There was a sense that healthcare is different from other non-health professions because of the harm that can occur to people, real harm that's physical. So while the risk assessment may look, in a certain way with how the Law Society runs Law Pro, or how the architect regulator runs Pro-Demnity, but for a college that is involved with health professions, that risk assessment can change because of that harm. So another factor that was discussed quite extensively. And as we talk about the finances and the inevitability, I would say, of the cost of PLP increasing, does professional choice of the provider matter? Do they start to think about whether they're able to get this insurance or coverage elsewhere if our costs continue to climb? So again, all of these factors went into what we've bundled into the regulatory risk. Next slide. Financial risk is somewhat different in that I will say the assessment of the risk right now is the assessment of the risk right now. And this can be changed probably more readily than the other two because there are ways to de-risk. There are ways to manage the finances. There are ways to get money from the profession that will fund reserves. But there are many ways that we can manage this particular risk that are more immediate, but not losing sight of the other two. So right now we have the college's finances, which includes PLP, so it's all part of the same financial statements. We do not have protection from the regulatory assets. I'd say that it's played out in the last few years in terms of trying to build our operating reserve in the reality of having underfunded PLP and trying to catch up with that at the same time. And how much can you go back to the profession as the college to say we need money for these things? And oftentimes that I've heard, it's tied back to, well, the regulator's just asking for more money, and we're trying to communicate more that there are two aspects. But all of these finances are together, and the assets of the college in the current iteration are not necessarily protected from claims that could happen. We've had unpredictable results, so you've heard in some orientation about the concept of loss provisions. We've had surprises in terms of what we must add to the income statement, which increases expenses and creates deficits, and sometimes quite significant. We've managed to manage that better with the increase that took place last year of about $485 to the profession, but there are still a number of other issues and concerns. And so they, as I've said, they've looked at the probability and they've looked at the severity, and that dot is where it is because of where we are currently, but not necessarily where we would need to stay if we made some changes to the finances, but it wouldn't necessarily look at the whole risk platform holistically, which is what you're being presented with. Next slide. Some additional financial information that came in after the task force finished its work, and this is related to the reserve that we keep to fund those extreme claims or situations where we have a reserve of $22.5 million that is reserved for PLP. It is not used for other activities. It's used to ensure that we're protected on those 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 year kinds of claims that we might get. We have heard from our actuaries that our reserve is likely low. based on our current reality, and the recommendation is to go to 41 million, up from 22. We could also make that less, and it could be 29 million and still be an acceptable amount based on their actuarial analysis. But that money has to come from the profession. That money has to come from the surpluses that drive the reserves up. And that is something that was presented to us after July 31st, or on July 31st, but after the task force had finished its work. If you think about the adequacy of the insurance policy, and we have $2 million per occurrence coverage up to a $10 million aggregate, and then the insurance policy kicks in for the next 20 million, that we could increase that. So we can always make changes to that. The premiums will go up, the cost would be higher, but there's certainly ways to address that. And we can address significant events through a levy with the membership because we have the ability to charge a fee every single year. I know the Law Society had a situation where they were underfunded by $200 million back in the 1990s. And so they went out over some period of time to collect the money from the profession, essentially, which was probably quite high. And I don't think it wasn't 1 year, it was over a period of time. But they were then able to think about that offering and make a number of changes to their program as well. And as I said earlier, the last bullet on the right, I would suggest to you that increasing fees to the profession for this aspect of the work currently, the increase is inevitable. We have the reserve issue. We have the unpredictable nature in the way that the program is structured with the current thresholds of coverage. We have the need to cover the operating reserve, and as I mentioned earlier to Nazar's question, the College Performance Measurement Framework requires us to have a reserve at minimum 25% of our operating costs, and we're $5.5 million short. We will have to think through how to cover all of these different aspects fairly quickly, and obviously dependent on your decisions or directions with PLP. Next slide. The task force spent a lot of time thinking about other models as well. We had some people around the table who were from these organizations, and we had others that came in and presented to the group. You can read more about the various programs, and we can try to answer your questions as best as we can today. But I think there were some themes that emerged that as we look to these different programs, you can't compare apples to apples here. Every program is different, but most had independent subsidiaries. So they didn't operate them as a department within their organization. Most had independent governance. The Quebec College has just had legislation that actually disbanded the board of that separate arm, but most have a separate board of directors for that activity of the malpractice protection. They have some degree of college oversight or influence, but again, you can make decisions in terms of how much separation you want with the subsidiary corporation and what the board looks like and the governance decisions. And there's a spectrum of what any organization could do in separating those entities. They've all separated their finances so they don't commingle. In the Quebec College case, the FARP ODQ, they have legislation that allows them to report individuals where there's some concern, there may be incompetence or professional misconduct. That is through legislation. That was not a decision that was made by the individual program. They had to have an act that allowed that to happen. And the final point is all of them have legislation authorizing these programs. So this is a non-legislated activity for RCDSO. But all of these four programs that we looked at have legislation that says they can operate these programs. It doesn't say they have to or they're obligated, but there is authority to do so. Next slide. So in terms of options, I'm going to take you through the three options that were presented by the task force. And they range, as you can see, from status quo on the left with minor tweaking to fully divest PLP from the RCDSO, meaning we would, as an institution, we would no longer directly operate it. And it was seen to be that there are many nuances within each, and I'll talk you through some of them. But these are the three major ways that the college could move forward in recognition of the benefits and the risks and how you assess those based on where you want to go. Next slide. So I'm going to start with status quo. And the task force talked about the modifications. So we learned that we could have a different terms of reference for the PLP committee. There could be a greater separation of PLP committee from this council, because right now you don't have membership on it other than Jamie, who's the chair, and that was intentional to have it as a public member, not a dentist, and then have complete separation from this council. And you could look at that to do something further, but it would still be a committee of the college. Separate the finances to a greater degree, revisit the insurance coverage, maybe pay more premium for greater coverage. Look at differential premiums. What's the risk profile of dentists? You could look at the ones who are activating the coverage more than others. You can look at higher deductibles. We've talked in orientations sessions about the data, that some of it's there, some of it we could build, we could educate more, we could evaluate that education. None of that would change the risks that have been presented. It would help the program, no question. It would probably bring a lot of benefits to dentists. It would probably bring a lot of benefits to the college. It might bring benefits to patients and the public if there's actual changes in practice. But it wouldn't take away from the some of the other risks that have been identified. And those are the words of the task force. So from the public's perspective, we would still own the program and still operate it, and you'd still have the tension and the conflict. And from a financial risk perspective, if we didn't address the issues that were referred to earlier, then we'd still have some of those issues. But again, those are the easier ones. So the key considerations are that you would retain the current program. So you've heard about benefits that the program offers, so you'd retain that. These are big changes that are in the subsequent two options. So you wouldn't have that management of change that would be required in going with this option, but you wouldn't address any of the risks either. And again, what I'll say at the end is, it's about your risk appetite. What are you prepared to accept, and what are you prepared to defend down the road if something were to be realized? And that's generally the question that you'll have to address. Next slide. I'll turn now to the subsidiary corporation, and this is about creating separation. So again, you can do that in a number of ways, but the task force thought that one of the cleanest ways that seems to be a solution that others have used is creating a separate entity. Separate corporate entity, you have a different board of directors, you hire a senior person who's a senior person from the insurance or the risk sector, you fully separate the finances, and you create it that way. Startup costs are just over $1 million. The reason for that is, well, there's a lot of legal and audit and accounting costs, but we also would have to disentangle a number of things. Probably the greatest cost would be information systems. Not that the information systems are allowing regulatory staff to look at the PLP information, but because they're all developed together and they're common platforms, and there'd have to be a lot of disentanglement of that would occur. And then the annual operating cost, depending on how you structure it, could approach $1 million. These are numbers that were created by talking to various experts to see where we would be. Obviously, there'd have to be a lot more analysis on this before we could tell you exactly what it would cost, but we wanted to bring kind of a quantum that would help you. The impact on the college would also be there because we have a reserve, which means we have money that's been invested, and those investments are part of the college because it's all one. So there would be an impact. The fees for PLP wouldn't come to the college. They would go to the subsidiary corporation. So there are a number of financial considerations, pros and cons as well. In all of this, in this option and in the next, the staff are the priority. We have 20 staff, as you know, and we want to make sure, and I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 weeks talking to them. I wanted to make sure that they were fully aware of this report, what it says, what we're thinking, no direction, and questions always come to, what about us? And absolutely understandable, and we want to make sure that whatever Council decides that we have as a key part of our consideration and implementation plan, how do we manage that very important aspect? Increased separation from the college will provide much greater risk mitigation, but it may not be seen differently. So that was the concept of the task force. Like, you can create the subsidiary, but are you actually going to achieve what you want to achieve from a reputational side? And the public doesn't drill into these issues like you do. The public just relies on the quick information and forms opinions and conclusions based on that. So that could still remain. The college assets would be protected in a much greater way with a subsidiary, but as we've heard from a preliminary consult with legal counsel, it's not a guarantee. And so we'd obviously want to make sure that there was a structure that would allow for that to be close to a guarantee, but you can never have that with these structures, although it would be significantly improved over what we are looking at today. And we would have less influence. You know, you have an independent entity that's doing its work. That would mean that you as a council, or we as a college, or I as a registrar would not be able to tell them what to do necessarily if we saw some things happening that we didn't like. So that influence would decrease as well. Next slide. And the final option is related to not directly operating the program at some point in time. And this is an option actually that has evolved since the task force met. And they were certainly looking at it in a very thorough manner. But I think there have been some other suggestions that have allowed senior staff to perhaps think about some different ways to approach this kind of direction. So first of all, you could sell the book of claims, and then the program is done and somebody takes that on. And there's all sorts of intricacies with that. You could wind down the program over time. You could say at this point in time, and you'd have to give a lot of notice, we will not take inquiries to the college or to the PLP program, but we'll deal with the claims that we have until we get that down to a more manageable or much lower level. I think the other option that hasn't been explored as much is really thinking about an organization that could take this on. There are some organizations that might be interested in talking about this, but there's nothing that I could present to you today about that. But it would help to potentially preserve some of the benefits, some of the benefits that have been accrued by PLP in its current iteration. And it would also look to things like, what about staff? And what about, how this program is structured for dentists, because it understands the clinical environment. So there are some, I think, some unique opportunities to explore. It's not, I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is an option that shutters the doors and the windows. There are so many ways to do this and so many ways to explore it. And that's something that I'll leave for your consideration. Depending on the option, we don't know the costs. It would be variable depending on which way we went. But again, under key consideration, staff are the priority. And we need to consider that at a very high level within the implementation plan. As one of the task force members said, if the college wants zero risk, you don't run the program. Any way you run this program will have risk. And we deal with risk all the time. Every program that we have has some element of risk, but that was certainly a comment that they suggested to us. And we'd be consistent with other regulatory colleges in Ontario. We'd expect certain minimum coverage of the profession, and we'd look at ways to ensure that that is happening. And as I've said, there might be some other financial effects on the college, but again, you have a plan to deal with that in some responsible way. Next slide. I won't cover this in any great degree, but this is all about your risk appetite. What are you as a council comfortable with in hearing from this group of individuals who've lived in this world and have tried to assess where they think we are and tried to assess what they think could be possible solutions? What's your level of comfort with moving forward? And so it's looking at the mandate, the public protection mandate, looking at the elements of trust, looking at the finances, looking at the relationships that have been built. I know that there are some dentists who enjoy the fact that they can come to PLP and get that coverage. And there are others who don't believe that we should be running it. So it's hard to base decisions on that kind of perspective that varies across the profession. But respectful relationship also includes things like being transparent, being open, talking about decisions that need to be made, decisions that have been made, and why. Next slide. So I think it's the second last slide, but just to really important considerations as you start your discussion. You must decide that risk tolerance, as I've mentioned. And really the questions, can you have a level of comfort that you can operate PLP of the future without impacting the public interest mandate? And so some have said, We've run it for 50 years with no problems. So what's the concern? I would push back on that and say there have been challenges along the way. There have been challenges that you can see from some of the media exposure. There have been challenges with finances. I can't tell you what happened in the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s, but over the last decade or 15 years, the time that I've been here, there are lots of challenges. So it's not like it has not had its share of issues to be addressed. So it has operated for a long time. There are many reasons to think that it's been successful, but there are also things that have been addressed along the way. Will the decided course of action make us more trustworthy as a college in the eyes of many of our interested parties? Will the profession accept that increased fees are palatable without having choice? Does the assessment of risk change because it's a non-legislative program or because it's a healthcare program? And I just wanted to leave you with those questions so that you're considering this in as thorough a manner as possible. Next slide. And so what's happened in the last 4 weeks or so is I've spent a lot of time with others and talking to PLP staff, talking to college leadership, sharing the report, sharing the options, being really clear about what the options are for your consideration, being clear that nothing's been decided, committing to being open and transparent as we move forward, and talking to the PLP committee and all the staff. The Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, and you'll hear from Mark Eckler in a few moments, talked about this extensively on August 14th. The executive committee had some discussions about this. Obviously, the exec didn't come forward with any conclusions or recommendations. That's coming to you from the finance committee, and you're here today. And the based on whatever direction you decide and when you decide it, we as staff will develop a full implementation plan that you will see. And it will be, in some cases, exploration of maybe different options, and as much detail as we can provide that will allow you to really solidify whatever that decision is for you. Next slide. So I will turn it over to Hanno, and we're going to have, I think we're going to have a break, but I'll leave that with Hanno. You're going to hear from Mark talking about the Finance Committee, then you're going to have a discussion. And we can certainly talk about whatever information that you want clarified. Want to know your thoughts on risk tolerance. We want to do a straw poll just to see an anonymous straw poll with status quo, subsidiary, divest, don't know, and see where we are as a council, and then see where we land by 11:45 or 12 o'clock. Hanno?
Thank you very much for that, Dan. So, Council, just to give you a little bit of a lay of the land, I mean, we are looking at approaching a break. The break is going to be about 10 minutes. I have a few minutes that if you have questions, so this is not a time to offer opinion, this is not a time for discussion, all that will happen after the break. But if we take a few minutes now, if you have questions about what you heard from Dan or something that you feel you didn't fully understand or needs a little bit more information. So I'm going to start with you, Daniel.
Thank you. Just quickly, I want to commend the council for moving forward in this direction. I thought the task force report was excellent. My question, and I'm trying to decide, and this question may only reflect my own lack of knowledge of this area, but in looking at and trying to compare the subsidiary model with the full divestment model, I'm wondering if the full divestment model might result in a potential risk to the public, in that could the new insurers, private insurers, make a business decision that they're not going to cover certain high-risk procedures because it's not in their financial interest to do so. They either don't cover them or they charge premiums that are not realistic. And therefore, those dentists or dental specialists who do these highly complex, risky procedures stop doing them. And as a result, the patients who need them now have nowhere to go. So is that a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. I think it relates to what model is ultimately selected in terms of not operating it directly. So if the model is to say that dentists are on their own, they must go out to commercial providers or whatever providers are available, that could happen. If the model is an organization that says we're willing to consider taking this on and operating it in a similar manner, and they're familiar with the dental environment and clinical practice, then again, it's possible, but it's a totally different scenario from the first one that I mentioned. So again, it really depends on how we think about that moving forward, and what we're saying to the profession in terms of where are you going after this. And the question from the profession that I hear is, well, okay, who do I call now? Well, you still call us. Like, we're not talking about days or months. We're talking about a long period of really exploring what this needs to look like.
But could the subsidiary model address that? That a condition could be that you can't do what I just suggested, and even though it's still distinct separation financially, et cetera, there's some more control that we're making sure the malpractice insurance is still set up so that the public is protected.
So I would say, and I don't want to get into too much of a legal conversation. I know Sarah Yoon is here from Weirfolds. I think you could have that risk with a subsidiary, because you can control the subsidiary to a certain degree. You can set it up with objects, but then it's its own entity and it makes its own decisions. And so even if the college created that subsidiary, I think your scenario that you've described could happen. Again, I'm not putting a probability to it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Nizar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dan, it was an excellent presentation. I want to commend the task force as well. The executive summary was really well laid out. My understanding of the PLP is that it's one of the lowest cost programs in the country for dentists in terms of malpractice insurance. And if that understanding is correct, a concern I have is that should we explore the divestment model, that it could result in higher premiums to be paid by dentists, and then the impact to the public is a higher fee schedule in order to make their practices more viable. So my question is, has that actually been borne true, that hypothesis, in any other jurisdictions that you've seen where it's publicly funded through private insurance companies, and we're seeing knock-on impacts to the cost that public are having to pay?
So I don't have enough depth to be able to answer that about any kind of payment scheme. What I would say, though, to your question is that to me, it's a narrative that we're the lowest cost. We have not been funding as a college this program to the level that it needs to be funded. And with the various pressures that I mentioned, we are inevitably increasing the cost of the program, even if we stay status quo. Those costs are going up. And so I'm really trying to shy away from the narrative of we're the lowest cost provider, because I don't know if we will be as we deal with all these different pressures. And I don't think this is answering directly your question about, will this translate into more fee, higher premium for dentists, greater fees in the fee schedule. But we have 7 of the 10 provinces and the 3 territories that use different providers. They don't operate it directly. And those premiums are what they are, and they're higher than ours right now. And I don't know if that translates directly into fee schedule changes, but they are what they are, and they're there already.
Okay, so I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And last speaker on my list is Anthony.
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep my comments brief because I think I'll probably want to speak to it after the break and after the next presentation. But I just wanted to commend Dan on the presentation. I read through the whole material and I kept going through it and through it and through it, and it was very repetitive, and that was good. But I think you really have brought it home and have brought clarity to what you've done. I'll just say one thing, and then I'm going to stop there because I do have some other comments later on. I think we, as a regulator, and our mandate to protect the public should be primary. And I respect the other 2 gentlemen that have voiced some concerns, but that is number 1. And unfortunately, in today's environment, we cannot wear 2 hats and expect to be fair to both. We either do one very, very well, or we helter-skelter. And I think, Dan, you've done a great job of bringing those points in. And again, I'll get into it a little bit further with examples of what I hear out there from colleagues, what their comments are, but I'll stop there. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Anthony. So, Council, right now it is 10:42. What I'm going to propose is a 10-minute break. When we come back, we are going to have the opportunity, or you are going to have the opportunity, to respond to a straw poll, and that the first thing that will do is indicate if there's any consensus that appears to be building up. We will still then take time for discussion. So again, this was an opportunity to ask questions for clarification. When we come back following the results of the straw poll, you will have an opportunity for further discussion. We're going to also turn to Mark, who is going to be speaking to us as well. So this is sort of the pause in this part, but we haven't finished with it. We're going to take a break until 10:53, and I would ask that before you step away from your computer, that you simply turn off your video, please. And we will come back at 10:53. So originally, according to schedule, we were going to be doing the straw poll now. Upon reflection, you've had the opportunity to hear from the registrar. We think it may be more beneficial to give Mark Eckler the floor in a moment to do his presentation, and then following his presentation, you will have had information from the registrar, you will have had information from Mark Eckler and the committees he's representing. That may be in a more appropriate time than to do the straw poll and get an idea of whether or not consensus is starting to form. And so before I turn it over to you, Mark, I'm just going to ask, I think, Angelo in the background, if you could just get the straw poll ready so that once Mark has completed his presentation, we can then do the straw poll, see where we are in terms of any kind of consensus, then go into discussion mode before we entertain any motions. So at this point in time, I would like to turn it over to Mark Eckler, Chair of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, for your presentation, Mark.
Hanno, thank you. I'm flattered that you think it'd be more beneficial. I'll try to live up to it. I want to start out by thanking the task force for spending the time to give us much information that we needed for the discussion today. Dan, an excellent, thorough, yet concise presentation. To the entire RCDSO staff, especially to Jeff, Kelly, and Sharon, who supported the FAR committee yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you all. At our FAR committee in August, our committee heard the same presentation you did today. We reviewed the report, its analysis, and its options presented. We then had a detailed discussion about the options. Like today, we all had questions. I don't want to preempt any of your questions or comments, but I do want to assure you that we had extensive debate on the options that are before us. There was first actually unanimous agreement that the status quo of PLP at the college needs to change. While the cooperation of PLP has been successful to date, the regulatory, financial, and reputational risks are high to continue with our current model. We had a lively discussion about the reputational and the regulatory risks and how, as a college, we understand those risks and also how we should measure them. Our focus was what puts the college in the best position 5 years down the road and further. At what risk do we want to accept for the program that is not part of our mandate? What will we be prepared to stand and defend should any of these risks materialize? It is safe to say that the committee completely understood the financial risks. We are also aware that there are different ways to mitigate these risks. Creation of a subsidiary corporation may be one option. The costs have been estimated for you. There will be an impact to mitigation for both the staff, the college costs, and subsequent fees that we may have to charge our profession annually. It was by a majority vote that the FAR committee is recommending that the council approve that the college begin the process of examining options with the view of divestment from PLP. It was the majority vote after concluding that it was the best path forward for the college to divest, to cease operations of the malpractice program at some point to be determined, because this would remove in its entirety the regulatory, financial, and reputational risks, while continuing to ensure patients have recourse. We would have to mandate there would be minimal liability protection for all dentists consistent with other Ontario health colleges. This would remove regulatory, financial, and reputational risks while continuing to assure that the patients have recourse. There's a lot more to consider as just how this would transpire. There's many ways to divest should the council decide to go down this road. It is positive to see that a partner, which Dan alluded to, a partner may be able to take on PLP as possibly one divestment option, as this has not, yet it was not fully explored at the FAR committee. The implementation to divestment would need to consider the costs to the college, pay optimal attention to the human resources, a reasonable timeline, and maintain as many benefits for patients as possible. And the college would need to manage the continued risks until the plan is complete. This is an extremely important strategic topic for the college. I look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion as we did in August. Hanno, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So what I would like to ask now is for council to take the time to view the straw poll, which is going to be placed on your screen. The poll is being shared with you now. You can take out your phones and scan the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and enter the poll number on the screen to participate. And that poll number is 1410209. We'll give everyone a few seconds to get set up. We ask that only council members participate in this poll. Pardon me?
Yeah, that's the one I'm getting as well. So when we,
I'm not on it, so I don't see it.
so you can see it, so we'll see what's happening.
So Daniel's seeing April, you're seeing April. Okay.
Is anyone having difficulty accessing the, can somebody help Amelia and Deborah?
So what you're being asked, the questions that you are being asked to consider are on the screen now. And you're allowed to choose one, right?
Just one.
And you're being asked to choose one reflecting of where you are right now. And if you are still having problems, please put your hand up and I will send Aldwin.
Divest.
Oh,
And you can see the number.
thank you, Vatsil.
60/40.
Anthony, do you have a question? Anthony, I think you may be muted still.
I've succeeded. I found my solution. Thank you. But just
Okay.
give me a minute so that I can vote, okay?
Okay, we will for sure.
Thank you.
What's the total head count? I think 23 or, how many voting, man?
There are, I think, 22 people here today.
We're at 18.
Are we? Okay.
There's 4 people not logged in. 19.
Oh, 20.
22 is the total.
We're at 22?
We're at
No, 22 is the total council members.
Okay.
We're at 20.
Okay, I think there are only 20 people at this meeting, right?
22.
Oh, are there?
David, Brian, and Anthony Mayer are missing. The others came in. So
What about Noah?
she's here too. She's on screen.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
The straw poll's already a majority. If you add 35 and 10, it's 45 to 55.
Okay, I think we're still waiting for one more person because I believe there are 22 people who should be voting.
There, it's 22.
Okay, thank you. So what we have is, in terms of explore the option of completely divesting from direct ownership and operation of the PLP is 59%. Those who are not sure yet, 32%. Explore the option of a subsidiary corporation for the operation of the PLP is 9%. And continue to directly operate the PLP as currently structured is 0%.
Yeah.
So, seeing that, and before we enter into discussion, it is clear from that that continuing on with the status quo is not an option that is on the table. So I would ask if we could have the motion brought up that given regulatory, reputational, and financial risk, college staff, council direct staff, I misspoke, that council does not support the college continuing to directly operate the professional liability program as it is currently structured. So if we could have that motion on the screen, and we will vote on that, and then if that passes, that eliminates that option, and then we can go back to our discussion. So I would be looking for a mover, Deborah, seconded by Amelia. And again, I would ask you to use your virtual or Zoom hands to indicate your agreement to that motion. Okay. Okay, and so we have
Just simple majority.
21. That's unanimously carried. Thank you for that. So that motion has been unanimously carried. You have seen the results of the straw poll. I would ask you to lower your hand, and now we will have the opportunity to enter into a discussion. So we've had the opportunity for clarification. And what I would ask you to do is if you have something that you would like to say, you have an opinion, or you have options that you want to discuss, when you do so, I would ask that you be aware of the fact that what we're looking at this through is the lens of serving and protecting the public interest. So that needs to be at the forefront of comments that you're making or suggestions that you're making. And at this point in time, I will start with a speaker's list. Nalan, I'm going to go to you first, please.
Yep. Thank you, Hanno. First of all, I'd like to commend the task force for that very exhaustive report. I think it was really well done. And it's not hard to walk away from that and realize that there has to be a change, that like the current path is not sustainable, as can be seen by the vote that we just had. And so when you have a change, there has to be a clearly defined starting point and then an ending point. Who knows where the ending point will be, but the clearly defined starting point, I think, is important. And I don't believe we have that. And there's a risk by not having that. So just some numbers. I know this from before we had our fee increase. Our PLP component of the registration fee that the dentist pays was about $680. And comparatively in Quebec, I think it was $1,375. And if we were to go to a private source, it was $2,100. So those are the numbers before we had the fee increase that was instituted a year ago. So that's a clearly defined starting point, $680. However, that's false because, as we've seen, it's artificially low because the reserve fund is not being funded properly, and for other reasons too. So if we were to make this change, this could be a problem if suddenly members are used to paying $680, and then if it ended up in some private group to issue the insurance, it went to $2,100. This is a problem for communicating. This is a problem for our members. So I think if we move in this direction, should be some consideration to a clearly defined starting point. What exactly does the PLP insurance cost? Thank you.
Thank you, Nalan. Next on my list, Aaron. Microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the excellent presentations and the very informative options that have been laid out. Now, one thing that I noticed was the number one recommendation. The task force highlighted that the program is effective and efficient. So one thing that I think we're all in agreement with is this is a program that has huge benefit to various stakeholders, and that's not something that's up for question. I would like to see some more exploration done on the opportunity to transfer this program somewhere where this value could be maintained. So to some organization that has some interest in oral health and the interest of our patients. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for this. If the program was housed elsewhere, I think there would be opportunities for the program to grow and also expand into areas that would be of even bigger benefit to the stakeholders that aren't constrained by the RCDSO's mandate. So for a couple examples I can think about, they would be a little bit more free to use the data if they're not under this restriction of the conflict that we have. They could use it for various things, for CE courses that another organization could develop. Maybe even a mediation program could be reinstated that might help to divert low-risk cases away from the college if it could be worked out through separate infrastructure. A lot of these things can't really be done within the RCDSO's mandate because of the conflict. So I think that transferring ownership of the program outside would deal with a lot of the risks that we've presented. And also I think it would provide a lot of new opportunities. So I'm hopeful that we could see some more exploration into this realm to see what could be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And Anthony?
Thank you very much, I know. I would like to just lower my hand there. I would just like to point out that speaking to dentists at functions at the dental society level is that I often heard and hear, what the heck does the RCDS do for me? Like, I mean, I pay my fees, they represent me. What am I getting out of it? They just don't understand. So I think we can focus on what we will be able to do for them, and that's obviously to fulfill our mandate on a provincial type basis, and that is to protect the public. And we can do that by offering them the remediation aspect we do if something ever comes in terms of a complaint or anything else. Being a member of the ICRC, our aim is always to remediate. What can we do to make this individual a better dentist? And I think if we take that and focus in on that, that's how we can be a benefit to the entire profession, make their life easier so that they have an easy flow through their professional years. With regard to I already voiced my opinion before, we can make sure, we can mitigate that they have coverage. We can from the examples of other organizations that have done that, and we shouldn't be concerned about the investment income that we lose from having this $25 or so million sitting there and gaining some income from that. We can concentrate on our own funds and our own fees, and to have a buffer there and be a regulator as the best regulator that we can. Again, we can't have two hats. It's going to be difficult the longer the period goes on for regulators. And so let's be the best regulator as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, Anthony, you were breaking up periodically there, so I just want to give you the opportunity to clarify. So are you then speaking more in favor of creating a subsidiary or in terms of divesting, or what is it that you were speaking in favor of specifically?
Sorry to hear that I was breaking up, but definitely in terms of divesting completely.
Okay, in terms of divesting completely. Okay, thank you. Next on my list is Vivian.
Thank you, Hanno, and thank you for the task force, Mark. And I think this is very, I was really debating last night because I hear a lot of conflicting information. And today, I think because our role here is to protect the public, and I think, of course, it's important for the dentists who have the coverage for liability. I'm thinking that if we diverse the program from the college, I think the mechanism should be there to make sure all the dentists have the proper coverage. And I believe when I was chatting a little bit with Sarah that for all three options, there will be, the college will be there to ensure that all the dentists are properly covered. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is Peter.
Thank you, Hanno. I think, we can talk about the financial concerns. We can talk about the reserve shortfalls. I think ultimately, what's going to decide this whole issue is going to be the ethical and moral dilemma that we all face as a regulator who sort of plays both hands in a situation through PLP. We're trying to please the patient, we're trying to please the profession, we're trying to protect the patient, but at the same time we're trying to protect the dentist as well. The other point I would make is that I think it's probably, after this meeting, would probably be a good time to see if we can get some comments from public and also from the profession as well, just to see what they think of this. I think it's a huge issue, and I think if it's just 20 people sitting around the table making that decision without input from either the public or the profession, I think that would be a mistake. Thanks.
Thank you. Jamie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me also thank the task force and all your numerous presentations, Dan, and Mark for your synopsis of finances. A couple of points here. One, it was a unanimous decision that we look at divestiture, and I voted in favor of that based on financial risks, quite frankly. I know there's reputational risk, but I do believe it's not appropriately run from a financial perspective. So thanks, Mark, for pointing out everything that you did in your meeting, your last meeting. We need to communicate very well to the dentists going forward. We have to communicate to them on the basis, all right, the council voted status quo is not doable. I think there's going to be a number of questions from the profession as to what really is the outcome of a decision that we've made today. So, whatever that communication strategy is, I think we need to have it very clear. And when we were doing the straw poll, there was a fair component of that poll who really didn't have an opinion or didn't have enough information. And so when we go down the divestiture route, we need to know much, much more. I frankly, the costs associated that I saw with both divestiture options seemed very high to me. And so in the process of looking at divestiture, we need to see proposals. We need to understand who the potential partners are in order to make a final decision on which way we go, whether it's a partnership with someone that's like-minded or perhaps providing the same benefits to the public and to the profession. So I strongly urge us as council to ask those questions and demand more information. more in-depth information on possible solutions and communicate that journey with both the public and the profession. So thank you.
Thank you. Judith?
Yes, thank you. I have to say, my voice carries anyway. I have to say that I probably agree with most of the things people have said, but I just wanted to add that, we talk about financial risk in some ways as not being as though it should not be the foremost consideration, and that's true. But I think that once you are into the area of financial risk and experiencing financial risk, that leads to reputational risk and other risks coming to fruition. So I don't think we can ever really not look at the finances. I'm glad to see that status quo is off the table. A lot of assumptions, I think, were built into this analysis in this report. But one of the things that we're not talking about yet is the fact that the issue of the underfunding of operating reserves is what I would call a clear and present danger for this college. And it's becoming clearer to me that we really don't have the capacity to both fund operating reserves and to fund the sort of the gap, even up to 29 million, with respect to the PLP reserves. And so that leaves us with having setting up a subsidiary or divesting. To me, a subsidiary is a non-solution. I think it's an option that provides some people with an element of almost psychological comfort. But the possibility of real financial protections for the college and therefore for the public are really absent in that model, I think. I think that it's, as I said, I think it's a non-solution. It's just, in theory, separating it out so it doesn't appear maybe with our financial statements or whatever. I don't know if they do, but the point is that it's not going to have the kind of impact that we need it to have. And so that, for me, leaves us with divestment. So I'm totally in favor of divestment. I also need more information about what I would hope that would look like. As you know, I've said before, I'm a lawyer, and so I pay Law Pro. I also know that as lawyers, the combination of our membership fees and Law Pro is probably double, if not a little more, than what dentists are paying. And that's neither here nor there. It's just that, and you're right, a number of years ago, when the Law Society found that it had mismanaged the books, for a period of several years, we were paying $10,000 a year so that they could recoup the shortfall. And so it is done. I'm not recommending it. I'm not saying, I think that we need to keep in mind that the dentists have to be able to practice with a level of insurance that secures the public interest and their own, and that is not sort of like massively unaffordable. But I do think that the way to go on this is divestment over, a defined period of time with a probably, again, we'd need more information, but probably with a model whereby you had negotiated a deal with another company, like Law Pro or whatever, to take on dentists, and that insurance with whatever that entity is mandatory. And in that way, the public is protected because dentists still have mandatory insurance. It might not function in the more sort of holistic, humanistic way that apparently PLP is operating, and I really admire that approach. But we'd have to see. I mean, you can build all kinds of things in when you're setting these things up from scratch. So I'm wholly on the side of divestment. And I just wanted to say that I really wished that there was no I don't know yet option because on that poll, because I think that I'd like people to take a position on council. I'd like to know what that position is. And you can always say, I need more information, I don't know yet. So that's always the case. I need more information. I don't know yet, but I know enough to know what my position is going to be so far.
Thank you. Osama.
A great presentation, Dan. And it's a good report. So I have 3 comments, and one of them is actually a question. The first one is, what percentage of dentists already obtain additional coverage? And that may play into all this, and it may have a role in terms of the data that's necessary here if dentists are already obtaining additional insurance. The second is, there's the report, but then there's, as Peter mentioned, obtaining more information from or surveying stakeholders. That would be valuable as well in addition in going forward. One of the things in the report that I'd like to comment on is the value of the risk assessment. Maybe I disagree with some of the comments already made, but the value of the risk assessment in the charts that were made were not very valuable to me. I've never seen, usually when you have a risk assessment, it's compared to something. So this needs to be a comparative risk assessment. So you need to compare the different routes or the different options to one another based off of the risks. They're not in essence separate because they're being compared to one another. And so modeling would be very important in this situation. So in essence, you'd have to gather some more information and do some modeling for all the different options, including what Daniel had mentioned is a big red flag, obviously, for, that may have reputational implications as well. So I think this is a great start, and we have arrived at some progress, right? We haven't come up with a full solution yet, but we've definitely some progress. But I also think that in order to really come to a good solution, there needs to be comparative risks, comparing, it's called a comparative risk assessment, and modeling of the different options.
Thank you. Mark Eckler.
Could I just ask, when you say different options, you're meaning options within divestment or options
I would say
between the different options?
Between them. Yeah, between them.
Thank you. Mark Eckler.
Thank you, Hanno. So I have 2 comments. The first comment is speaking as chair of the FAR committee. My second comment will be speaking as Mark Eckler, councillor. Minor clarification to Jamie's comment. The FAR committee did have a consensus that it was unanimous that the status quo should not remain as is. It was not unanimous that we voted in favor of strictly divestment. It was by majority vote. That's the first comment. Now, speaking as a councillor, not as chair, The question I have in following up on what came to mind after Daniel's comment is, should divestment be the only option explored? And without guidance not to wind up PLP, and after learning information last night about claims made and that, what we can mandate practicing dentists get insurance, which is a must to protect the public. What do we do with the retired dentist who is not going to take out insurance, yet can have a claim made against them? And if PLP doesn't exist, how is the public protected, as I'm closer to my retirement age than at the beginning of my career, if you didn't tell by my bald gray hair? So that is a question I don't know the answer to. I have an 80-year-old father who practiced 49 years, never knew the college for good reason, was in good standing. Who protects him? Who protects the patients, the 35,000 patients that he treated? Because to my knowledge, and unfortunately from my experience, there doesn't seem to be a statute of limitations on complaints or inquiries that can be made.
Thank you. Nizar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the fear of being redundant, I want to echo my congratulations to the committee and others. My decision at this point is to support full divestment. The decision was arrived at by three influencing factors, which I share with my colleagues. My review of the entire task force report, the majority, thank you, Mark, for the clarification, the majority recommendation of our FAR committee, and my own professional history with this kind of an issue. I want to lend support to my council colleague Judith, whose observation about the subsidiary option, for me, forgive the candor, but for me, a subsidiary option is kind of like suggesting we're half pregnant. We either are or we're not. And so I think we need to come down on a firm direction, given the influence of some of these things that we've read in the report and we've heard from our colleagues. What I would suggest is, depending on which option we land on to support the staff and the FAR committee's additional investigation, we as a council help create some form of a framework, a decision-making framework that allows the investigators to come back to us eventually with a series of options within a single option, like either divestment or subsidiary. And I think we actually have that in our strategic slide, the one that accompanies every single meeting that is in our package today. And so for those who may be following online, there are plenty of principles, a principles-based framework that we can use as a council to direct others to do some additional investigation. For example, the 3 points that have always resonated for me are: we take an evidence-informed approach to decision-making, we apply a risk-based perspective in regulating the profession, and we integrate the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I think is aptly appropriate both for dentists and our responsibility to the public. And so, the last thing I would say, and then I'll give it back, Mr. Chair, is I talked at the very beginning about my professional experience with this. I've been in healthcare for 33 years, and the Ontario Hospital Association faced this similar decision in the early 1970s as well, where there was perceived, and therefore real, conflict of interest associated with their ownership of Ontario Blue Cross. They divested themselves of Ontario Blue Cross, and so I would share that example with my council colleagues, because you can look at this issue as an opportunity. The divestiture of Ontario Blue Cross in the healthcare system among hospitals and others resulted in an endowment fund that in the billions today that continues to pay decades later. And so should we decide as a council around divestiture, I think we have an asset based on our public good, our public sort of our goodwill and brand associated with the PLP, that we can actually turn a particular let's call it a benefit that would allow the council to further fulfill its mandate and support patients going forward. So I leave that as a hypothetical possibility around divestiture. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have 4 more speakers on my list, and I just wanted to let people know, I mean, we are taking notes up here in terms of comments that are being made, and my hope is that when you see the motion that comes on reflecting the comments, you will also take comfort in the fact that the language talks about asking or directing staff to explore the options. So again, nothing is carved in stone at this point in time. I think it allows for ongoing dialogue, more information, questions that still need to be answered. So again, I don't want to jump the gun, but I do want to sort of put it out there that language about exploring the options would be in a motion that you will be asked to consider very shortly. Amelia, you're next.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. I agree with many of the comments that our council members have mentioned, like Jamie, Osama, Judith, Nizar, Mark. Thank you. I was actually in the don't know category of the straw poll because I don't have enough information to make a decision based on what I've read several times, and today I believe that we need more. Another comment I have is I read from the report that there's a potential shortfall of 6.7 million to 18.6 million if there were a catastrophic event. I'd like to know, what is that percentage of that happening? Do we have that information?
I would turn to Jeff to maybe respond to that.
So those were based on the recommendations from PwC, our actuary, and we can provide that we can come back and provide that information. Some of the information was based on their modeling of like a 1 in 100 year scenarios, but they did also other scenarios that were less than that. I don't have that information in the top of my head, but we can provide that information. And FAR, it was all shared with FAR as well.
Can I comment? Okay, once we get that information, what's that chance of that happening, let's say, on a yearly basis? Is it just one-time basis or ongoing basis of a catastrophic event?
Well, I think it's a one-time basis, but it could be 50 years, it could be 20 years, it could be next week, right? It's impossible to tell when an unexpected catastrophic claim will occur.
But, well, my concern is, let's say there were, okay, it happened like, what, 2017, that large class action lawsuit. What's the chance of that happening like once a year? Like it happened, let's say 1 year. Is there a chance of it happening again in 2 years? Because that would be a huge shortfall.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Well, my concern is this. Let's say there was that catastrophic event. Let's say, obviously, there was one 2017 of multi-million-dollar lawsuit. If you had that one event, let's say next year, I'd like to know, is that chance of happening again another year? Because you never know with these class action lawsuits. I'd just like to have more information on that.
Dan? I don't think we're able to comment on that.
I was going to say the same thing, like we're trying to use a crystal ball to predict the future, which we don't know, which is why we rely heavily on actuaries to provide us what their assessment would say is the right level that we need to be at. We, council, can make a decision not to increase the reserve, but you would be doing so with risk. And I think that's kind of the point, that we have to rely on that information, and then we have to use it either as given to us or some other way that you think would best manage that risk. But nobody can predict the future in terms of, well, they talk about 1 in 100 years. Is it 100 years from now, or is it next week, as Jeff said? But to be prepared, you rely on that assessment to put the reserves up to the right level.
Okay. So I realize I'm out of sequence. I'm not asking a question, I'm offering clarity. Based on my statistics background, what a 1 in 100 year event is an actuarial estimation of the probability of catastrophic, unpredictable events occurring. The closest example we can derive from that as an actual example of a 1 in 100 year event is COVID. The previous world pandemic was the Spanish flu. So it's the unlikely, unknowing likelihood of, or probability estimated through a series of random events actually taking place. And so the PwC report specifically says, in the event of another COVID, this would be the impact to PLP. So it's a highly unpredictable, unknowing, and that's why Dan and our CFO are not giving us a confirmed answer, because they literally would need to have a crystal ball to say, what is the likelihood of a 1 in 100 year event circumstance?
Thank you for that. Next on my list is Deborah.
Thank you, Hannah. Again, excellent report and highlighting some important information for the RCDS going forward. From what I'm hearing, is there's just a lot of information that we need to know with this next step going forward. It's like planning a trip. You want to know the details along the way. You have the end goal, you have the beginning, but you need to know all the factors in between. So I'm suggesting we ask the task force to provide details on the models with the risks and the benefits of the different options so that we can make better information. We could also ask the task force to look at the Blue Cross model, successful Blue Cross model going forward, to learn from their journey, going from basically an independent insurance taking over the medical liability associated with the medical profession, because we're following in that pathway. So we can learn from their experience, so we could consult with them. Another also possibility dealing with the retired dentist model and looking at that is maybe possibly looking at a hybrid model. So as of a certain date, we look at these dentists that are part of the RCDSO have private insurance, but the ones that are retired still have a PLP option that's phased out over a period of time, so there's just not a hard deadline, so that we could accommodate different options. That's another thing I would ask the task force to look into. Thank you.
Thank you. Last on my list is Jamie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'm hearing from some of the professionals, and in particular your comments, Daniel, on what dentists are going to do going forward, understanding there will be a new model at some point in time. Can we ask those investigators to look at, and maybe this is part of what Peter was asking in terms of surveying the professionals, what are the best parts of the PLP, I should say, and try and encompass those into a model going forward. And again, ask partners who are involved in that decision potentially to ensure that the best parts of the PLP are enshrined in something new. Mark, for you, estates of dentists, by the way, are covered under PLP. There are claims made via estates. So it goes beyond just the retired people. Final question is for you, Dan, and that is, would a separate entity be legislated in some form? And with the CMPA and the CPSO, is that legislated? I understand that the government somewhat funds or backs up the CMPA, and would we expect the Ontario government potentially to backstop a new structure?
So I can't certainly speak for the intricacies of those details, but I can say that the CMPA, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, is a completely separate federal entity. It has no ties whatsoever to regulators. It has, through years of negotiations, had funding that comes through the federal government. And that is to support premium payments. It depends on specialties as well, because some specialties of medicine are higher risk. But none of what we're talking about is looking at a GR strategy at this point to look at legislation or to have any independent separate entity funded. That's not within our purview. If this council is looking to explore what are the options, what could divestment look like, what could as you said, what are the best things about what we do currently that we would like to see preserved, we would have those discussions with potential partners or organizations, and then they would have to develop that and figure out what that needs to look like for their organization. So I think what I'm hearing, and I'll turn it to Hanno, is this sense that we want to preserve some things from this program, but we don't necessarily want to directly operate it. And so can we live in both worlds? And so I think that's a reasonable expectation to start to look at that and try to figure out if that's possible.
Thank you. And Nizar, your hand is up, but I didn't know if you was, okay.
And I appreciate, Mr. Chair, I'm sort of dominating the conversation. It's absolutely fascinating to me. I wanted to assure the very legitimate question that my colleague Mark asked earlier about what happens to those dentists who have stopped practicing and or more importantly, what happens to the patients who are affected by dentists who have stopped practicing? It is very common. I would not take this comment as gospel, but it is very common for another absorbing organization to be responsible for prior conditions. And so as an example, as a board member, I have officers and liability insurance. When I stop being a board member, I am still protected under officers and liability insurance for any claims against the board's actions that may have taken place during my term. This is very common. It's quite acceptable. If Sun Life had provided us with that insurance and then subsequently Sun Life went out of business and Great West Life took on that responsibility, they would have to, under legislation of that approved merger under the Canadian Corporations Act or the Ontario Business Corporations Act, assume that responsibility such that patients can't be lost and say, because of that merger, I've now lost my ability to be appropriately compensated. So I would say, please don't take that as gospel, but it is informed based on just a number of other experiences I've had.
Thank you very much. And last speaker on this topic is Rod.
Thanks, Hanno. I've listened to everybody around the table. By the way, some excellent discussion. I think I resonate highly with what Aaron raised and has been repeated, that we need to find a path forward of maximizing, optimizing, or maintaining the benefits of the current system while minimizing the reputational, regulatory, and financial risk. That's the nut of it. And, and also we need much more information. I, as we go forward, I speak as a FAR member and one of the, I guess, dissenting opinions going forward, but primarily my dissent was the need for more information. And that, I think, has been echoed highly today. Looking at the lay, and we need to look at the lay of the land out there a little more deeply. I think we need to understand further what Alberta and Quebec, how they fend off reputational, regulatory, and financial risk when in fact they are maintaining in-house systems. We need to, there's 10, 11,000 dentists in our organization. There's 31, about triple of that are doctors in the province. And Dan mentioned, per Jamie's comment, that the CMPA program is a federally funded program, but I believe, I'm not for sure of this, that it is paid by the Ministry of Ontario of Health. And hence, there's a natural conflict of interest in the government representing and paying out that money to doctors. And it is an interesting fact that it's been in place for 50 years, but My concern that I raised with the group was the equity of doing that, given what we've been asked to do from a reputational standpoint. And I think we need to be heads up going head forward on that, on what we do. So it's, am I in favor of divestiture? Not necessarily, but I am in favor of change. And I really think we need to take a wide view on the landscape as we go forward and make sure we have, a comfortable, because divestiture on itself is not, can be a tough end. There's arguments to the effect that the CPSO's program, they are fully divested, is more of a doctor's defense fund rather than a public interest fund in the public interest. And I think everybody's had that aware in discussions in the past. So I'm in favor of much more debate in terms of before we make a decision.
Okay, thank you. And last speaker is going to be Mark Eckler.
Thank you. Sorry, Mark Trudell? Mark and Mark.
Mark and Mark.
We'll bookend it. Speaking as chair of the Fire Committee, following up on Rod's comment, just to, once again, clarification. The dissenting opinions on the Fire Committee were not against divestment. It was strictly to gather more information. So there was no opposition to exploration and getting information. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Trudell.
Thanks, Mano. My comment, my only comment, I speak from a position of as a public member and a member of council. I'm quite concerned about the financial shortfall of the reserve presently. I believe we all individually and collectively have a fiduciary duty to put that high on our radar. It's been brought to our attention by independent third-party financial advisors. I would encourage council that any motion going forward, now that we've gone around the table a few times, that a timeline be attached to that motion. And in particular, I'm concerned that we will make a decision to come back with more information, but I don't want that to correspond to punting the ball down the road again and again and again. I would like the motion to have a timeline so that this council, when it next addresses this matter, is empowered with not only additional information, but is also aware that time is of the essence to make an informed, thoughtful decision, but time is of the essence in light of the fiduciary duty we have in respect of from a risk management point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So what I have heard more often in taking the notes that I've been taking is voices in favor of divestment. We've heard lots of comments around more feedback, looking at a variety of proposals, seeing some of those before definitive decisions can be made. Mark Trudell just said he would like a timeline. Other people have said, we are going to take the time that it needs. So I think those are all comments that we've heard. So I would like at this point in time to have the motion put on the screen that deals with divestment. And I would like, when we see it, to draw your attention to the wording. And the wording is that council directs staff to explore the option of completely divesting from ownership and operation of the professional liability program. So I think that's more reflective of the kinds of comments that we've heard today. And hopefully that language of exploring the option addresses some of the comments that we did here. So, Deborah, are you making a motion? You moving to that effect? Nazir, you're seconding it. So again, I'm going to ask you to raise your virtual hands. All those in favor of that motion, please indicate so now. Okay, thank you. So that has been unanimously carried. Thank you all for your thoughtful, I'm going to turn it over to you, don't worry. Thank you all for your thoughtful consideration, for your questions, for your comments. I think that was really important. Hopefully, you've also felt that taking this time and giving you the time to ask these questions and the time that it took in terms of listening to the presentation has helped you to make a more informed decision. So I'm going to stop speaking now, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan or Harinder for closing comments.
Well, Harinder can close, but I just wanted to address. Oh, there's some, I will step back.
So
Could I say a couple of remarks just because they may address possibly what some of you might want to say? Because I wanted to go back to Mark Trudell's comment. And what I would suggest, I know it's not in the motion, but we will bring you a progress report in December. We're in uncharted territory in terms of what we need to do to pull this together, but I've heard your direction in terms of exploring it, figuring out what is it that we value from this program, exploring what possible partners there might be or organizations. I can't commit to you to have that whole plan by December, but I can commit to bringing back a progress report in December if you're comfortable with that. Go through your list, Hannah.
yes, so thank you, Judith. I've got a list now, so I will go back to that. So Rod, you're next on my list. Or first on my list.
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. I'll do it soon.
Oh, okay, thank you. So then I've got Judith, who'd like to make a comment, and Jamie. So Judith, I'm going to you next.
Could we not have a subsidiary amendment of, to also direct that staff provide council with not just different options, but different models of divestment with a comparative sort of SWOT analysis, such as Osama was referring to, and that all of this be done for the December meeting, so that we have the time frame and we have more specificity in terms of what we're actually looking for.
So I'm not entirely clear, and I don't want to take up council's time, but I'm happy to talk to Osama, who raised this, and others, because I'm not entirely clear what you mean, because now you're talking about a subsidiary.
No, did I say, did I say that? No, I meant divestment models.
Okay.
Sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah, and I think that would be part of the exploration. And so that may be, and I'm not sure how far we'll get, but that will be part of what we're looking at in terms of, what are the different models and what does it do for us? Like, there may be, it's a trade-off, right? In terms of we can get this, but not this. And that's part of the analysis.
Yeah, it's just that I thought the motion was a little bit vague and didn't really have the timelines in it and didn't really have the sort of the comparative analysis as an ask in it. So maybe I could just go on record as putting those asks in along with others.
Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, my final comment, I promise. You put in every one of your scenarios, Dan, of the options, staff as being a priority. I'd like to ensure that when we do the investigation, and I'm speaking now on behalf of the chair of the PLP committee, it's a fabulous staff, lots of experience. Anybody who would want to partner with the RCDSO offering an insurance option would want those employees without question. So I'm asking council to ensure that our staff is still at the top of the list when it comes to looking at solutions. That's one point. Mark Trudell, you wanted to expedite the decision on how to balance the operating reserve. Was that your question?
The impetus for timing
Yes.
is the operating reserve deficit. I do not want to expedite that. What I want to do is I'm encouraging council to encourage the leadership team to put forth additional information in an expedient manner so that we are in a position empowered with additional information to make informed decisions at the earliest possible time. Distinct from continuously studying this matter into the next council and the next council and the next council, while all the while we are operating under the veil from a risk management with a substantial reserve deficit. And from my assessment, we're in a very dangerous zone in terms of our fiduciary duty to not take our eye off that. Does that make it clear?
Much clearer. And I think what the profession will see out there is, the PLP no longer is status quo. And at the same time, to be able to balance the operating reserve and the deficit, they're going to have to pay up. And I encourage the communication to the profession to be wary of that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anthony?
I have one final comment. I look forward to the update in December at our next meeting, but I want to leave with a positive aspect. PLP has been a great and continues to be a great program, and time has certainly it's on its side. We have a great value there, and it's a great value in terms of the book value. People will be very, very interested in taking that over in whatever form that will be, and obviously we'll be part of that decision making. But let's not forget that we have value there, regardless of deficits and all these other negative aspects that we know are there. And so I look forward to the fact that I don't think there will be huge difficulties about finding entities to take that over for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And I'm going to turn it over now to Harinder for closing comments, please.
Thank you, Hanno. And I want to thank all the council members for their wisdom, their comments, and the task force which produced the results, and Dan for presenting in a very clear way what you did today. I want to re-emphasize what Jamie asked and Mark Trudell has addressed. In view of this report and our deficit and all the information is in front of us, and a fiduciary duty this board has, I am again re-emphasizing what Mark Trudell said. We cannot punt it down beyond December. So there will be more information. We have been talking at executive and between Dan and I, there's going to be huge communication emphasis, and staff is getting ready for it. I think we need to communicate it very clearly to staff, to the membership, maybe the public need to know as well. And I think our communication staff is ready. So thank you very much to all, and I'm very happy the way things have gone. And I hope that everybody feels that they have been heard, and this will be the way we will be conducting our council meetings from here on. Thank you.
And thank you, Harinder. And taking a lay of the land, I think this has been a wonderful opportunity to share tons of information and questions and concerns. It has been a more lengthy process than we've been used to in the past. I think it's probably important, Andrea, that we're going to sort of take the next item on the agenda and postpone it after lunch. I think what we all need now is we need a lunch break. So I thank you again for all that you've done this morning. It is now 12:10. I'm going to ask us to reconvene here at 1:10. And a reminder that when you leave your computer, you just turn your video off. And for those listening on the public, the YouTube will stop now, but will start up again at 1:10. So thank you all, and have a good lunch.